History remembers the Mongol Empire for its speed, its discipline, and its unbroken chain of conquest stretching from the plains of Mongolia to the walls of Baghdad and the forests of Hungary. But behind every victory recorded in the annals of Rashid al-Din, behind every burned city noted in the secret history of the Mongols, there existed another story one carried in whispers, half-buried accounts, and the fragmented testimonies of those taken alive. For noblewomen captured during the westward campaigns of the 13th century, what awaited beyond surrender was not simple slavery, nor the structured captivity common in European or Persian courts. It was a methodical breaking of lineage, identity, and bloodline, a process meant not only to remove an enemy elite from power, but to unmake the very memory of them. In the Mongol worldview, conquest required more than territory. It required the extinction of rival futures. Noblewomen embodied those futures, daughters of Khwarezmian governors, wives of Russian boyars, princesses of the Tangut Shia, widows of Georgian commanders. Their fate served as both political weapon and psychological terror. What happened to them was whispered across empires, shaping how cities resisted, how envoys negotiated, and how entire kingdoms weighed the price of defiance. When the Mongol horsemen breached the final gates of Gurganj in the spring of 1221, the city that had once served as a jewel of the Khwarezmian Empire collapsed into panic. Chroniclers such as Ibn al-Athir describe the moment the defenders realized their walls had failed. Fires blooming across the bazaars, arrows descending like locusts, and families scattering toward the palace district in hopes of sanctuary. Among the last to flee were the noble households tied to Shah Muhammad II and his mother, Turkan Khatun, whose influence had shaped court politics for decades. The Mongols did not distinguish between soldiers and nobles when the gates fell, but they recognized the value of lineage. Captured noblewomen were pulled from the palace chambers, their names recorded by Mongol officers who understood the political weight each one carried. The lists included daughters of provincial governors, wives of commanders loyal to Jalal al-Din, and widowed sisters of Khwarezmian aristocrats. Their rank did not shield them. Instead, their lineage determined the severity of their fate. Those tied most closely to the ruling family were separated immediately, escorted under guard toward the Mongol command tent erected on the western bank of the Oxus River. It was here that Tolui, youngest son of Chinggis Khan, established a temporary court of judgment. The Mongols believed that noble bloodlines held spiritual weight. Chinggis Khan's Yasa stated that the destruction of a rival elite was essential to maintaining the destiny of his own lineage, the Borjigin. Noblewomen captured alive were therefore viewed as political threats as much as spoils of war. They embodied dynasties capable of re-emerging, raising future claimants, or forging alliances that could one day challenge Mongol supremacy. Because of this, their captivity served a purpose beyond immediate humiliation. It dismantled the continuity of the families they came from. Tolui ordered the noblewomen grouped according to political relevance. The daughters of high-ranking Khwarezmian officials, among them Fatima bint Arslan, Safiya al-Khatun, and the young wife of Governor Azrak Malik, were brought forward first. Persian and Arab historians later wrote that the Mongol commanders inspected them not as individuals, but as symbols of defeated households. Their clothing, their accents, even the way they carried themselves indicated the power they once possessed. In the Mongol worldview, this power needed to be inverted. The soldiers did not immediately enact violence. Instead, they performed a ritual stripping of status. Silk veils were removed, jewels confiscated, embroidered belts cut away. In Mongol culture, taking a person's belt, especially one belonging to the elite, symbolized the removal of their authority. Noblewomen who had once presided over courts in Gurgang, Kanya-Urganch, and Khiva now stood barefoot in the dust, their former identities reduced to nothing more than names on a scribe's list. The first stage of their ordeal was psychological. The Mongols excelled at breaking the will of conquered elites, believing that terror was as valuable as steel. The noblewomen were forced to watch as surviving male relatives, cousins, advisors, sons of governors were executed one by one. This was not the indiscriminate slaughter described elsewhere in the sack of Gurgan. It was targeted and ceremonial. Each execution severed a branch of lineage, ensuring that no future resistance could grow from the remnants of the Khwarezmian court. Among the witnesses was Zainab al-Sugra, daughter of a minor official, who later recounted to traveling merchants that the Mongols made the noblewomen stand in silence as the executions unfolded. They were not allowed to look away. The message was unmistakable: your dynasty ends here. The second stage came at night, when the Mongol officers selected individuals for interrogation. These sessions were rarely about gathering information. Instead, they functioned as deliberate humiliation strategies, designed to erase the symbolic power noblewomen carried in their own culture. The Mongols understood that aristocratic women were central to political alliances marriages. In Khwarezm, Georgia, Ruses, and Shia often cemented treaties, succession claims, or military pacts. By degrading noblewomen, the Mongols demonstrated their intention to destroy not just armies, but the social structures that produced them. Names appear in surviving accounts. Princess Rusudan of Georgia, taken during the campaign of 1221-1222, described the dark tents, the interrogations, and the way officers forced noblewomen to recount their family histories, as if mocking the legacies those histories represented. From the Tangut Kingdom of Shia came similar testimonies, records of aristocratic women seized during the final campaign of 1227, stripped of their cultural roles before witnessing the destruction of their state. The Mongols believed that the true defeat of a dynasty required the destruction of its women in spirit and lineage. Some noblewomen were taken as war brides by low-ranking soldiers, a calculated inversion of social hierarchy. Others were absorbed into labor camps attached to the army, forced into menial tasks that contrasted sharply with the courtly lives they once led. These transformations were not random acts of cruelty. They were engineered dismantlings of political identity. By dawn, Tolui's scribes finalized the lists. Some noblewomen would be transported eastward toward Karakorum. Others would be distributed among the Tumans as a means of rewarding loyalty. But all of them, regardless of rank, had already crossed a boundary from which return, social, political, or personal, was nearly impossible. The fall of Gurganj marked the first major wave of noblewomen whose lives were reshaped by Mongol conquest. Their stories would echo across Khwarezmia, Persia, Ruses, and beyond, giving rise to whispered warnings. When the Mongols take the daughters of a kingdom, the kingdom itself has already died. The fall of Gurganj did not remain an isolated calamity. As the Mongol armies pushed westward under Subutai and Jebe in 1221, the same pattern of collapse followed them into the Caucasus, reshaping kingdoms that had endured for centuries. In Georgia, where the Bagrationi dynasty traced its lineage back to the age of King Mirian, the news of Mongol victories arrived like a spreading fire. Chronicles written by Mekitar of Ani describe the royal court attempting to disperse its noble families into the mountains, hoping the monasteries of Gelati and Ikalto would shelter the women whose marriages held the kingdom's alliances together. But the Mongols moved too quickly, cutting across the Aragvi valleys long before the families reached safety. Captured noblewomen were treated with the same precise intent seen earlier in Khwarezm. Among those seized near Tbilisi were Tamar Bagrationi, Sopio of Tbilisi, and Anna Maria of Kakheti, each representing a thread in the political weave of the Georgian kingdom. Subutai understood that while fortresses and armies mattered, the truest strength of a dynasty often lay in the women who forged alliances through blood, marriage, and inheritance. Breaking them meant breaking the fabric that held the monarchy together. In the Mongol encampment near Rustavi, the treatment of these noblewomen followed a structured pattern. First came the removal of identity. Silver crosses, family rings, ceremonial scarves embroidered with the red lion of Kartli, every symbol of nobility was taken and catalogued. This was not a looting of wealth, but a ritual separation of woman from lineage. To the Mongols, identity rested in outward markers. Removing them stripped a captive of the world that once defined her. Next came the recounting. Subutai ordered each noblewoman to recite her genealogy aloud, who her father was, which marriages she represented, what estates were tied to her dowry. Chroniclers note that the Mongols listened not for information, but for the unraveling of authority. Speaking one's ancestry in captivity transformed ancestral pride into a reminder of loss. Women who once mediated between kings and generals now stood before their conquerors, reciting the names of men who could no longer protect them. Their fates varied, but none would return to the roles they once held. Tamar Bagrationi, whose lineage connected her to ruling houses in Armenia and Kartli, was reportedly assigned to a low-ranking commander from the Suldis clan. This was no accident. The Mongols saw inversion of social order as a tool of conquest. A princess made the property of a common soldier symbolized the collapse of an entire hierarchy. Others were placed in traveling labor caravans, forced to carry supplies, tend fires, or serve in camps that roamed between the Volga and the Caucasus. These tasks, mundane in nature, were devastating in implication. A noblewoman's life was built upon ceremony, influence, and visibility. In the caravans, she vanished into anonymity. Similar stories emerged as the Mongols entered Cuman-Kipchak lands near the Don River. The Cumans relied heavily on marriage alliances linking them to Ruses, Hungary, and Georgia, making Cuman noblewomen critical to political stability. Captured daughters of the Itbash and Toktovu clans like Aisha and Kirjan were processed with the same purposeful erosion of identity. Mongol commanders knew that through these women flowed ties to broader confederations. To sever the women was to sever the alliances themselves. The Mongols displayed many of these noblewomen during negotiations with besieged towns, presenting them as silent warnings. These were not ransom tools, but symbols of irreversible defeat. A noblewoman in chains was a message carried on the wind. Resistance leads not only to ruin, but to the unmaking of your future heirs. When the Mongols advanced into the territories of Ruses in 1237, their reputation preceded them. Cities like Ryazan and Kolomna prepared for siege, but fear spread more quickly than the armies themselves. Russian chronicles describe how noblewomen of boyar families fled toward forest monasteries, hoping to escape the fate whispered across the steppes. But as Ryazan fell, the Mongols captured the wife of Yuri Igorovich and several daughters of prominent nobles. Their treatment mirrored earlier patterns, forced witnessing of the destruction of their household symbols, public exposure to break the morale of surviving defenders, and later dispersal among Mongol units. At the court of King Bela IV of Hungary, envoys returning from the frontier brought stories of noblewomen dragged across frozen plains, their status erased, their identities reshaped into tools of psychological warfare. Such reports influenced diplomacy across Europe. Bela's attempts to protect the Cumans, for example, stemmed partly from fear of what the Mongols might do to Cuman noblewomen, and by extension, what might later be done to Hungarian ones. Across these regions, Khwarezm, Georgia, Cumania, Ruses, the Mongols, applied similar tactics because they understood a universal truth. Noblewomen did not merely belong to dynasties. They carried dynasties. They were living alliances, symbols of future heirs, custodians of household power. By reducing them, absorbing them, or inverting their roles, the Mongols dismantled the cultural and political structures of the conquered territories more efficiently than by force of arms alone. The world remembers the Mongol campaigns through battles and sieges, but the collapse of kingdoms often hinged on quieter scenes: silk veils falling into dust, family rings taken by foreign hands, princesses recounting the names of fathers who would never rescue them. These were the moments that unmade empires, not through death, but through the extinguishing of lineage. As the Mongol Empire expanded across the plains, mountains, and riverlands of Eurasia, their treatment of captured noblewomen became a structured extension of conquest rather than a chaotic byproduct of war. Whether in Khwarezm, Georgia, Cumania, or the principalities of Rus, a recurring element appeared in eyewitness accounts and surviving chronicles: the existence of what later writers called the night rituals, a series of practices meant to break lineage, assert dominance, and erase cultural identity. These rituals were never officially recorded in the Yasa of Chinggis Khan, yet their consistency across regions suggests that commanders treated them as an unspoken doctrine and inheritance passed down through orders, example, and tradition. The earliest references come from the final days of the Khwarezmian capital. Persian merchant diaries recovered near Urgench describe groups of noblewomen being taken into Mongol tents after sunset, their escorts replaced by guards who spoke little and explained less. The women, including Safiya al-Khatun and the governor's widow Azari Amira, were told nothing of their fate. What occurred inside those tents was never fully documented, but the aftermath was clear. Noblewomen emerged stripped not only of their jewelry and robes, but of the poise associated with their rank. Chroniclers noted the silence that followed, the kind of silence that grows when fear takes permanent residence in a person. Similar accounts surface in the Caucasus. During the 1221-1222 campaign, after Subutai's forces overran Georgian defenses near the Mutkvari Valley, the noblewomen captured among them Tamar Bagrationi and Sopio of Tbilisi were subjected to practices designed not for pleasure or brutality alone, but for political dismantling. Mongol commanders understood the symbolic power noblewomen carried. They were the guardians of dynastic continuity, and their degradation communicated the end of that continuity more effectively than the execution of kings. Nightfall became the instrument of this transformation. Mongol encampments were structured by rank, the ordo or command tent at the center, followed by circles of tents belonging to officers, then the outer ring of common soldiers. Captive noblewomen were held in the inner circle, not because of respect, but because their humiliation was considered a matter of strategic importance. Here, rituals unfolded that involved forced attendance, recitations of lineage, and symbolic acts meant to dissolve the identity each woman once carried. It was common for Mongol commanders to ask a noblewoman to recount her ancestry repeatedly, as if the repetition itself eroded the pride that came with her name. The practice of inversion, assigning a high-born woman to a low-ranking soldier, formed part of the ritual's political purpose. A daughter of the Bagrationi might find herself bound to a Koran or Arban commander, someone who in her world would not have been permitted to speak to her without formal court approval. This inversion spread terror more efficiently than death. A noblewoman married or bound to someone beneath her rank represented a dynasty reduced, a lineage inverted, a future denied its rightful form. Cuman noblewomen captured in the Kalka River campaign experienced similar rituals. Chronicles mention Kirzan of Toktavul being forced to recite the marriage alliances her family had forged with Kievan princes. These recitations, conducted before Mongol officers, served a symbolic purpose. They laid bare the networks the Mongols sought to destroy. Once spoken aloud, these networks became maps to be burned. The Mongol worldview treated such alliances not as abstract political ties, but as bonds residing in the bodies and identities of women themselves. To break those women was to break the alliances. When the Mongols advanced into Ruses in the winter of 1237, the rituals became harsher, shaped by the resistance they encountered. After the fall of Ryazan, noblewomen taken from the courts of Prince Yuri Igorovich and boyar families were lined up in the Mongol camp and made to observe the destruction of their household symbols. What followed that night was whispered across the lands of Vladimir, Suzdal, and Kolomna. The noblewomen were processed through a sequence of humiliations that ensured their identities were severed from their past. In some cases, Mongol officers deliberately removed their veils or kokoshniks, the ornate headdresses of Russian noblewomen, breaking the most visible marker of their status. But the night rituals did not consist solely of humiliation. They also involved integration and absorption of noblewomen into the Mongol social fabric, albeit in roles that twisted their former identities. Some were reassigned as war prizes, others as laborers within the traveling households of commanders, and still others as ceremonial markers carried during negotiations with besieged cities. Their presence demonstrated Mongol dominance. The message to defenders was unmistakable. Your daughters and wives are here, already unmade. Your future holds the same if you resist. In the far reaches of the empire, similar patterns emerged. During the final campaign against the Tangut kingdom of Xia in 1227, chroniclers such as Guo Yuanzhen mentioned noblewomen being taken to Mongol camps at night, where rituals of identity stripping blended with forced labor. Their fates echoed those of Khwarezmian and Georgian captives. The Mongols applied the same structured dismantling of lineage, regardless of whether the dynasty ruled over deserts, forests, or fortified mountain cities. These night rituals became a form of psychological warfare, that rippled across continents. Rumors outpaced Mongol armies, carrying descriptions of noble women who once presided over courts, ceremonies, and intricate political marriages, now standing veilless in the dust, reciting their genealogies as strangers laughed. These stories reached Hungary, Poland, the Seljuk Sultanate, and even the weary courts of the Abbasid Caliphate. In many cases, entire regions chose surrender over resistance, not because their armies were outmatched, though they often were, but because the cost imposed upon their noblewomen was seen as a fate worse than death. The Mongols understood this fear. They cultivated it. In the empire's strategic mind, the destruction of lineage was more lasting than the destruction of armies. Armies could be rebuilt. Dynasties could not. Captured noblewomen, broken through ritual, became living symbols of this principle, carried from battlefield to battlefield, as reminders of what it meant to defy the sons of Genghis Khan. The night rituals thus formed the hidden architecture of Mongol conquest, a structure built not of stone or steel, but of shattered identities, severed lineages, and the deep, enduring terror that accompanied news of their approach. Across the breadth of the Mongol Empire, the movement of captives, especially noblewomen, followed routes as deliberate as the campaigns that captured them. These routes, etched into steppe, desert, and river plain, served not merely as paths of relocation, but as corridors of erasure. What began at the moment of capture continued on the long road eastward, a journey that reshaped noblewomen from symbols of rival dynasties into instruments of Mongol expansion. By the time they reached Karakorum, the empire's political heart, they were no longer individuals of hereditary influence, but pieces in a system that rewarded obedience, diluted lineage, and rewrote the destinies of conquered nations. The road to Karakorum began in places where Mongol armies had recently broken resistance. From Khwarezm to Georgia, from Cumania to Ruses, captured noblewomen were gathered in small groups and assigned to detachments of soldiers tasked with escorting them across terrains, chosen to exhaust and disorient. The Mongols believed the physical journey was as important as the rituals of humiliation performed earlier. Bodies weakened by travel became easier to mold. Identity stretched thin by unfamiliar landscapes became easier to overwrite. The caravan formations were precise. At the front rode the officers, followed by wagons carrying supplies. Then the captives on foot or horseback, depending on their condition. Behind them rode guards whose purpose was not merely to prevent escape, but to assert constant psychological pressure. In the eyes of the Mongols, noblewomen were potential seeds of revolt. Their lineage could inspire future uprisings if left intact. The journey east was designed to strip away any remaining sense of belonging to the lands they had left behind. Captives taken from the fall of Gurganj remembered crossing the Amu Darya under watch, the river's cold water numbing their legs, as Mongol guards shouted commands. Some, like Fatima bint Arslan, described in later merchant retellings how the Mongols refused to let the women rest near the riverbanks, choosing instead to move them continuously until nightfall. By keeping captives in motion, the Mongols aimed to break the rhythms that noblewomen had known in their previous lives. No structured meals, no ceremonial routines, no moments of sanctuary. A mind starved of familiarity became easier to shape. From the Caucasus, the journey looked different. Georgian and Armenian noblewomen, taken by Subutai's detachments, were marched through the steep passes of Darial Gorge, a route chosen as much for its difficulty as its strategic value. Mountain winds cut through the woolen cloaks of women like Tamar Bagrashoni and Anna Maria of Kakheti, turning each step into proof that their old world had ended. Along the narrow paths, Mongol guards urged them forward with short commands, reminding them that hesitation was unacceptable. The mountains that once sheltered Georgian royalty now became the place where their political identities were unmade. Cuman noblewomen captured near the Kalka River followed the long steppe roads north of the Caspian Sea. Their journey lacked mountains, but the vastness of the steppe created a different kind of psychological dissolution. The horizon stretched endlessly, with no landmarks to anchor memory. The Cumans, known for their deep connection to the open plains, understood the land, but to walk it as captives, stripped of their roles, transformed the familiar into the alien. Riders from the Saldus and Baron clans ensured no conversations grew into plans of resistance. Speech itself became restricted to commands given and obeyed. For noblewomen from Rusas, the journey east began with frozen rivers. After the fall of Ryazan and Vladimir, winter caravans moved across ice-bound waterways, the groaning currents beneath the frozen surfaces, echoing the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Russian chronicles note that the Mongols preferred river routes in winter because they offered speed and minimized terrain obstacles. But for the captives, the frozen world symbolized a suspension of fate, a transition that neither belonged to their past nor offered clarity about their future. Food and shelter on the road were intentionally minimal. Noble women who had once eaten in halls decorated with icons, perfumes, or silks now received rationed portions of mutton and hard cheese. Rather than sleeping in chambers or pavilions, they slept beneath the open sky or in shared felt tents used for livestock attendance. This inversion of comfort reflected the Mongol belief that hardship purified captives of past loyalties. In such conditions, noble women who once commanded servants found themselves begging Mongol guards for additional water, warmth, or rest. Yet not all noblewomen were treated identically. Some, particularly those of renowned dynasties or exceptional political value, were assigned to the households of Mongol nobles long before reaching Karakorum. A few were given to commanders like Jibei or Kukuchu as early rewards for their part in campaigns. But even in these cases, the Mongols maintained a strict philosophy. No captive noblewoman should retain the status she held in her homeland. Even women of beauty or diplomatic relevance were reshaped into tools of Mongol authority, their roles determined entirely by the hierarchy of their new world. As the caravans moved deeper into the steppe, another pattern emerged. Young noblewomen were taught Mongol customs not as a kindness, but as preparation for the roles they were expected to assume once they reached the capital. They learned how to bow properly before a Mongol noble, how to distribute fermented mare's milk during camp rituals, how to tend fires used for metalwork, or how to maintain felt tents during storms. These lessons came from Mongol women, often the wives or daughters of officers, who understood the importance of integrating captives into the empire's domestic machinery. In these interactions, noble women from conquered lands glimpsed the future, awaiting them, one built not on lineage but on obedience. The road to Karakorum thus became a journey of unmaking. By the time the caravans neared the Orkhon Valley, the noble women who arrived bore little resemblance to the figures their homelands mourned. Their steps had memorized obedience. Their eyes carried the silence of those who understood that rebirth was not possible. Only transformation remained. And within Karakorum, a new world awaited one where the last remnants of their past would be stripped away beneath the watchful gaze of the empire that had consumed their nations. By the time the caravans bearing noblewomen reached the outskirts of Karakorum, the transformation that began on distant battlefields had already taken deep root. Yet the city nestled in the valley of the Orkhon River served as the final crucible of identity. Here, where Chinggis Khan's successors shaped policy, forged alliances, and commanded armies that stretched from the Danube to the Pacific, the noblewomen from conquered lands would shed the last fragments of their former lives. Karakorum did not simply house the Mongol elite, it absorbed the world they conquered. The capital was unlike any other city of its age. Travelers such as William of Rubruck described it as a patchwork of cultures. Mongol felt palaces standing beside Islamic artisans' workshops, Chinese scribes recording taxation orders, Uyghur merchants selling carved wooden icons. For a newly arrived captive, this blend of civilizations created a sense of dislocation. A Khwarezmian princess might hear Persian spoken in the marketplace, yet the voice came from a slave. A Georgian noblewoman might see a Christian church, yet find it built under Mongol patronage. Familiar elements existed, but never in the roles or structures one expected. This fractured reality was intentional. The Mongols believed identity dissolved fastest when surrounded by echoes of what it once was. Upon arrival, noblewomen were first brought to the administrative quarter governed by the Ordo, the royal household staff. Here, Officials assessed each captive's value not by lineage, but by potential utility. Intelligence, temperament, health, fluency in languages, and even skill at weaving or singing were evaluated. A noblewoman who once shaped diplomacy in Gurganj or Tbilisi now found herself examined like livestock, her worth determined through the cold lens of imperial necessity. The Mongols rarely wasted human resources, but they always redefined them. Those captured from powerful dynasties were often withheld from ordinary camp labor to be presented to higher-ranking nobles. Yet even they endured a rite of reduction. Every noblewoman underwent the cutting ceremony, in which the elaborate braids or styled tresses of their homeland were undone and reworked into step patterns. Hair held symbolic value across cultures, but for the Mongols, it represented submission. A woman whose hair had been reshaped in the Mongol style had crossed an irreversible boundary. Afterward came the issuing of garments. No captive was permitted to retain the silks or embroidered cloths of her past. Instead, each received a deal simple, functional, and identical to those worn by women of no rank. The Mongols understood that clothing sustained identity. Removing the attire of nobility removed the worldview that came with it. In the mirror-polished bronze shields hung around the camps, women glimpsed themselves unrecognizable. Once stripped of identity, noblewomen were sorted into three primary paths: absorption into noble households, assignment to craft or labor groups, or transport to auxiliary settlements supporting the city. Those sent into noble households, often to the families of generals like Ögedei, Chagatai, or Tolui, found themselves in environments where hierarchy was absolute. A noblewoman from Rusas might become responsible for tending the felt compartments of a royal juror, while a Cuman princess might be tasked with overseeing livestock movements. Even within these roles, Mongol women supervised them closely, ensuring the captives learned expected behaviors, lowering their gaze, presenting food with both hands, responding to commands instantly. Through repetition, even resistance wore thin. Labor groups formed a second path. These groups included weavers, cooks, tanners, and artisans, taken from across the empire. A Georgian noblewoman skilled in lyre playing might be placed among musicians who performed during feasts, not as an honored guest, but as entertainment for conquerors. A Khwarezmian noblewoman familiar with court poetry might find herself copying letters for Uyghur scribes. Each task reinforced one truth: lineage no longer mattered. The third destination was the auxiliary settlements, clusters of yurts and wooden structures surrounding Karakorum, where captives worked the fields, tended horses, or crafted goods for trade. This path reduced noblewomen to anonymity, the final stripping of social meaning. Many never returned from these settlements, absorbed into the enormous population that fueled the Mongol economy. Over time, noblewomen began internalizing the rhythms of the city. They learned to wake when the gongs rang, to move quickly when summoned, to keep silent during deliberations. Their languages blended Persian softened by Mongolian vowels, Georgian accented by Uyghur tones. A woman who once commanded servants might now bow before a boy younger than her own son. Within Karakorum, former hierarchies inverted completely. Yet despite their oppression, noble women noticed something subtle. The Mongols did not seek to erase them entirely. Instead, they sought to redefine them. A noblewoman, who adapted fully learning Mongol customs, proving herself obedient, might be married to a minor officer, or assigned as a concubine to a ranking noble. Such unions served political aims, diluting foreign bloodlines into the vast genetic web of the empire. Through marriage, the Mongols absorbed not only individuals but entire dynastic legacies. No matter their eventual placement, each noblewoman carried memories of her homeland. But in Karakorum, memory had no currency. Some wrote their lineage on scraps of animal hide and buried them beneath stones. Others whispered their names in their native tongues before sleeping, afraid they might forget. The city consumed these quiet acts of remembrance, just as it consumed the families and nations that once anchored them. For the Mongols, this was victory not only over territory, but over identity. Conquest ended on the battlefield. Unmaking began in Karakorum. This final stage ensured that no dynasty could reassert itself once its women had been restructured into the machinery of the empire. The daughters of governors, princesses of ancient kingdoms, wives of celebrated generals, all became threads woven into the vast fabric of Mongol rule, indistinguishable from the fibers of the Gurwals they tended. Beyond the walls of Karakorum and outside the bustle of its administrative quarters lay a part of Mongol society that few foreign chroniclers ever described in detail. It was not a prison, nor was it a labor camp in the conventional sense. It was a shifting network of encampments known among the Mongols as Kwei Hiram, the quiet enclosure. Here, noblewomen from recently subdued territories were held, while decisions regarding their fate moved slowly through the machinery of the empire. Some stayed for days, others for years. All entered the enclosure as distinct individuals. None left unchanged. The camp's location was never fixed. It moved seasonally with the army or with the court, forming a temporary satellite settlement of felt tents arranged in disciplined rows. From afar, the camp appeared identical to any other Mongol encampment round. Low structures of white felt, smoke curling from roof vents, horses grazing at the perimeter. But inside, the atmosphere differed. The camp lacked the laughter that usually accompanied family gatherings. It lacked the sharp, confident voices of Mongol women issuing instructions. Instead, Kie Kerem operated in a hush broken only by the sound of guards marching, or the low wind moving across the steppe. Life within the camp followed a strict schedule, enforced by appointed overseers. At dawn, women were awakened by a spear butt striking a wooden gong. They lined up outside their tents, heads bowed, while guards conducted a brief inspection. Clothing was simple, made from coarse wool that concealed rank and origin. Noblewomen who had once worn jewels or embroidered waistbands now tied their garments with plain rope. That sameness served a purpose. It prevented alliances based on shared status and forced all captives to view themselves through the same stripped lens. Meals were sparse fermented mare's milk, flatbread, onions, and on rare occasions, boiled mutton. The Mongols never intended to starve their captives. They were too pragmatic to waste resources by weakening useful labor. But the food was intentionally dull, a sensory monotony that encouraged compliance. Even flavor became a luxury reserved for those who adapted. Guards assigned to the enclosure were chosen carefully. Many were older or injured veterans who no longer rode with the main cavalry. They understood hierarchy deeply and enforced order without cruelty, yet without hesitation. While Mongol women managed households and economy, Kwei Kerem required a different type of discipline: quiet, consistent, unbreakable. Disobedience rarely led to physical punishment. Instead, transgressors encountered a colder sanction: isolation in a small felt annex, alone for days, hearing only the sound of wind and hoofbeats. Most captives learned quickly to avoid that fate. Throughout the day, women were divided into groups and assigned tasks. Some ground millet, others cleaned hides or twisted fiber for rope. These tasks mattered less for their productivity and more for their structure. The Mongols believed that labor, when repetitive, erased internal resistance. A noblewoman from Kievan Rusas might spend 3 hours rolling felt between her palms, her mind growing numb with each motion. A Seljuk noblewoman might kneel for hours trimming animal sinew. In time, their hands learned the work by instinct, and instinct replaced memory. Yet Kwei Kerem was not entirely devoid of cultural expression. At night, small fires lit the interior of tents, and noble women whispered stories from their homelands. A Georgian lullaby might drift through the camp before being drowned by the neigh of a restless horse. A woman from Bukhara might trace crescent patterns in the dirt, recalling tiled courtyards she would never see again. The Mongols did not forbid such murmurs. They simply ignored them. In their view, longing weakened captives faster than force. Occasionally, a Mongol noble or diplomat visited the camp. Their presence was rare but decisive. They inspected the captives discreetly, speaking with overseers about temperament, health, and skills. A woman who demonstrated calm, obedience, or versatility might be selected for household service. A woman who resisted, wept, or clung too fiercely to her identity might be assigned to distant labor settlements. It was not malice, it was governance. The empire needed order, not emotion. Some captives tried to escape. The steppe made that nearly impossible. The horizon offered no cover, and the Mongols' horses could run down any attempt long before dusk. Those who tried were not executed. Execution eliminated potential labor. Instead, escapees were bound to a pole for a day, exposed to the wind and sun, a lesson to the others that resistance had limits the steppe itself enforced. Despite the harshness, a peculiar dynamic formed among the women. They developed quiet alliances, small networks of survival, rather than rebellion. A Cuman woman might share a piece of cloth with an Armenian noblewoman. A Persian captive might translate quietly for a girl from Rus's. These connections eased suffering, but never threatened Mongol authority. Pain could be softened, but power remained intact. Then, without warning, decisions arrived. A messenger would enter the enclosure with a list written in the clear strokes of Uyghur script. Names were read aloud. Those called stepped forward silently. Some were reassigned to noble households within Karakorum. Some were moved to distant military settlements. Some, usually the youngest, were brought before the wives of generals for evaluation. Those not chosen remained, sometimes for months, waiting as seasons changed and new caravans arrived with captives from fresh conquests. The enclosure functioned as a crucible of identity. By the time a noblewoman left it, she had already learned the posture the Mongols preferred: steady silence, lowered gaze, minimal reaction. She emerged not as a noble of her former land, but as a resource shaped into whatever the empire needed next. Quakerem did not break women violently. It broke them by asking nothing of their past and everything of their endurance. When the camp finally moved with the army to its next position, the earth it vacated remained marked shallow trenches where tents once stood, smooth patches where feet had walked in circles during daily tasks. The wind erased these marks quickly, just as the Mongol system erased the identities of those who lived within its walls. Among the Mongols, the act of resistance was not interpreted through the language of morality, but through the lens of practicality. Everything the empire valued: speed, obedience, mobility, depended on eliminating disruptions before they reached the level of threat. This included military uprisings, tribal disputes, and, in quieter corners of the empire, refusals made by noblewomen captured in war. The Mongols did not consider such refusals emotional or symbolic. They considered them obstacles, and obstacles required measured solutions. The first form of resistance came long before a captive reached Mongol territory. When a city fell, groups of noblewomen sometimes clung to temple walls or barricaded themselves inside sealed chambers. Chroniclers from Khwarezm described entire families refusing to step forward when ordered. The Mongols rarely responded with immediate violence. Instead, they used a method that required neither blade nor fire. They waited. They stationed guards at all exits and allowed hunger to become the negotiator. Within hours or days, doors opened, fear overriding loyalty to walls that no longer offered safety. It was an early lesson in the empire's quiet patience. Once inside Mongol custody, resistance changed shape. Some noblewomen refused to speak. Others refused food. A few attempted self-harm to avoid being claimed or relocated. These acts disrupted the flow of administration, which the Mongols found unacceptable. They did not punish such behavior out of anger. They punished it to restore order. The first punishment was withdrawal of warmth, a method not recorded in many chronicles, because it left no wound. Tent flaps were left open during the coldest nights. A captive who refused to eat was wrapped in coarse wool and placed near the opening, exposed to steady wind. The steppes' chill, especially during spring or late autumn, could drain resolve faster than any beating. The Mongols believed cold, clarified thought. A stubborn woman often became obedient by dawn. The second method was weight discipline. A woman who refused orders was given a leather sack filled with stones or sand and required to hold it in her arms, unmoving, for long intervals. There was no shouting, no spectacle. A guard stood nearby watching silently. When her arms trembled or the sack dropped, the interval restarted. This exercise served two purposes. It exhausted the body and demonstrated clearly that time belonged to the empire, not to the captive. By evening, most resistance faded to quiet compliance. The third method was used only for those who attempted to flee. Escaping from any Mongol encampment was nearly impossible, but the attempt itself represented a direct challenge to authority. In such cases, a captive was brought before the camp overseer. Her hands were tied behind her back with a cloth knot rope, which could scar, and she was tethered to a central stake for a single day. She was offered food and water, but could not sit or lean. This practice exhausted the legs and blurred the boundary between night and day. At sundown, she was released without further punishment. The Mongols saw no need to repeat it. The memory alone prevented future attempts. More severe techniques existed, but were rarely used, for they contradicted the empire's interest in preserving captives as workers or bargaining tools. However, certain wars produced captives who wielded political influence in their homelands, wives of princes, sisters of governors, daughters of military commanders. These women understood their symbolic value and sometimes sought to damage it as an act of defiance, refusing to be paraded or assigned. For them, the Mongols used the enclosure of stillness. This enclosure was a small felt hut placed far from the main camp. Within it, the captive was given no tasks, no fire, no conversation. A pot of water and dried meat sat in the corner. Days passed in silence. The Mongols believed that isolation, when unaccompanied by pain, forced the mind inward until resistance collapsed from lack of structure. Guards checked the hut twice daily but did not speak. Some women broke within 2 days. Others endured a week. When released, they often moved with the slow caution of someone reacquainted with sunlight. Still, not all women bowed to these pressures. A few, known for political ties or personal pride, maintained resistance as a matter of identity. They refused every order, rejected every meal, ignored every instruction. The Mongols approached these rare cases differently. They brought such women before elder advisors, men and women who had known famine, war, and the collapse of old clans. These elders did not threaten. They explained. They spoke of the steppe, where survival depended not on pride but adaptation. They described the consequences of continued refusal, not harm but erasure. A woman who resisted too long might simply be relocated to settlements so distant that even her homeland would forget her name. This conversation, delivered with no anger and no rush, often succeeded where punishment failed. The Mongols understood that the most powerful force in human behavior was neither pain nor fear, but the instinct to preserve one's name. When an elder warned, "Your family will not know where you walk," many captives reconsidered. For those who still resisted after all measures, fate depended on the overseer. In rare cases, a woman was turned over to the wives of high-ranking nobles, who then determined her role. Mongol noblewomen were pragmatic, but not gentle. They assigned defiant captives to tasks requiring endurance, carrying water for long distances, grinding grain at dawn, or tending livestock in wind-lashed fields. These assignments were not torture in the conventional sense, but they reshaped identity through exhaustion. The point was not to hurt the captive. It was to wear down the edges of defiance, so that the empire could function without disruption. Foreign chroniclers later described these practices with alarm, believing them cruel beyond measure. Yet to the Mongols, they were methods of efficiency, not brutality. They did not aim to break the body. They aimed to break the interruption. As the empire expanded, resistance inside the camps decreased. Word traveled across conquered regions that defiance did not lead to heroic sacrifice, but to quiet, relentless pressure that drained spirit more effectively than open violence. By the mid-13th century, most noblewomen captured by the Mongols entered the camps with lowered heads, aware that resistance had a cost, and that the steppe had no mercy for those who wasted its time. Night on the steppe carried a stillness that felt different from the day. The wind moved across the grass in long, low breaths, and the fires inside the Mongol encampment dimmed into slow-burning embers. It was during these hours, when the camp settled into quiet, that the rituals for captured noblewomen began. These were not ceremonies of spectacle. They were deliberate, controlled, and shaped by a cultural order older than many of the kingdoms that had fallen before Mongol armies. The women who had been taken from distant courts, some from stone keeps, some from fortified cities, found themselves called into a small felt tent, chosen not for its size but for its simplicity. The tent held little beyond a clay basin of embers and 3 arranged objects: a bowl of water, clear and still; a strip of cured leather, darkened by use; a wooden spoon smooth from countless hands. The women who led the ritual were not warriors, but those who held authority within the household's senior wives, widows, or elder attendants. They summoned the captive without force, using a quiet voice at the entrance of her tent. The summons alone carried weight. It meant she was to take her place within the structure of the camp, and there was no path for refusal. Inside, the captive was told to kneel. The elders spoke little at first. Silence pressed into the space around the woman, revealing her movements, her breath, the tension in her shoulders. Only when the quiet had lingered long enough did the elder offer the first guidance. The 3 objects before the captive were explained not as symbols, but as choices. The bowl of water represented tasks tied to cleansing, carrying, and sustaining the household. The leather represented labor with the animals, requiring endurance and exposure to the cold. The spoon represented duties at the hearth, where food was prepared and where order within the tent was preserved. The woman was told to choose one. The Mongols believed that choice revealed a person's true nature, not in the object selected, but in how she reached for it. A hesitant hand suggested uncertainty. A quick one suggested impulse or hidden defiance. Some noblewomen tried to choose cleverly, interpreting the objects through the customs of their former homes. They were mistaken. The Mongols did not operate by the meanings foreign courts assigned to domestic tools. Here, the decision shaped a woman's role more than her past title ever could. After the choice, the elder performed the quiet set of gestures that marked the woman's entry into the rhythms of the camp. A few drops of water touched her forehead. The leather brushed lightly against her shoulder. The spoon was placed on the ground before her. Nothing in the actions was violent or forceful, yet the moment transformed her position. She was no longer an unassigned captive. She had form within the household. The ritual then shifted. The elder asked 3 questions, always the same, always spoken in a calm tone. Who were you? Who are you now? What do you fear? The questions were not meant to break the woman, but to measure her understanding of herself. The Mongols believed that a person's survival depended not only on strength, but on clarity. The answers were often halting, uncertain, or spoken with lingering pride from a life that no longer existed. The elders listened without judgment, observing not the words, but the manner in which they were delivered. A woman who answered with hardened defiance was expected to resist the structure of camp life. One who answered with trembling might adapt more quickly. The ritual was not a test to pass. It was an assessment of how the step would reshape her. When the questions ended, the woman was handed a cup of arag. Fermented mare's milk was a taste unfamiliar to most captives, sharp and heavy on the tongue. Drinking it was not a matter of preference. It signified the first act of taking sustenance from the world into which she had been brought. Refusal marked a rejection of the household's order. Acceptance, even hesitantly, closed the ritual. The woman was then dismissed, not with threat, but with a nod. She left the tent knowing her days ahead would follow the path of her chosen object. What she did not yet know was that the Mongols valued observation as much as action. A woman who resisted her assigned duties was not punished with immediate force. Instead, she was given more of the same work. The step had a way of shaping people through repetition. Tasks grew heavier until resistance bent into adaptation, or until a woman discovered endurance she did not know she possessed. Over time, many noblewomen found their identities shifting. The rituals that had startled them became memories. They learned the weight of carrying water at dawn, the rhythms of tending a fire through a cold night, the movements of horses that responded to quiet gestures more than commands. Mongol women, once feared as overseers, became daily presences whose guidance did not soften, but remained steady. Travelers from distant lands, Persian envoys, Rus merchants, Chinese chroniclers saw the changes and assumed the captives had lost themselves. But to the women who lived within the camp, the truth was different. Their pasts remained with them, shaped by long roads and fallen cities. Yet the steppe demanded a new kind of identity, one forged not through rank or lineage, but through the capacity to adapt. The night ritual continued across generations, shaping countless women whose names never entered official records. It was not remembered in chronicles or epic accounts, for it belonged to the inner life of the Mongol household. Still, its effect was enduring. It marked the first moment a captive stepped into the structure of the camp, a place where survival depended not on status or lineage, but on understanding the unspoken order of the steppe. Not all Mongol methods were carried out by soldiers. Much of what captives endured came from the hands of women already living inside the camp: wives, mothers, elder matriarchs, and widows who traveled with the Tumen. These women held their own hierarchy, separate from the warriors, yet deeply woven into the machinery of the empire. When noble women were brought into the encampments, it was these Mongol women who watched, judged, and shaped what happened next. The role of Mongol women within the imperial structure was far more complex than foreign travelers imagined. Persian chroniclers often wrote as though Mongol women were merely attendants or companions, but within the camp, they served as administrators, negotiators, and enforcers of domestic order. A nobleman's wives oversaw the distribution of food, the tending of animals, the management of servants, and the security of tents. When a captured noblewoman entered this world, she entered a domain already ruled with quiet authority. Many captive women were surprised by the indifference shown by Mongol wives. These were not women eager to humiliate rivals or assert personal dominance. They were accustomed to a life of constant movement and practical survival. A captured noblewoman's beauty, clothing, or lineage meant little to them. What mattered was whether she followed instructions, contributed to daily work, and did not disrupt the patterns of the camp. The first task many captives received was water duty. Mongol camps required vast quantities of water for cooking, washing, animals, and leather work, and the nearest stream was not always close. Captive women joined long lines of workers carrying heavy buckets across uneven ground. The Mongol women supervised, checking posture, pace, and endurance. This assignment was not meant as punishment. It was a test. A woman who complained or lagged behind signaled resistance. A woman who completed the task without being told twice was noted as reliable. The second task was felt maintenance. Mongol tent skurs depended on thick layers of felt, pressed from sheep's wool and treated to resist wind and rain. Captured women learned to soak, stretch, and dry the fabric under the instruction of senior wives. This work required strength and coordination. The Mongols believed that a woman who could shape felt could shape herself into discipline. A woman who refused, claiming noble status or delicate hands, found herself reassigned to more exhausting tasks. There were also women within the camp who watched for subtler forms of resistance avoidance, whispered conversations, or attempts to gather sympathetic allies. These watchers were usually older women who had seen multiple generations of war. Their authority did not come from position, but from experience. A suspicious glance or a misplaced word could earn a captive an interview with these elders. Such meetings were not interrogations. They were evaluations, carried out in calm voices and with questions that seemed simple but carried weight. The Mongols viewed truth not as something extracted by force, but as something revealed when the mind grew tired of maintaining lies. The elders' patience was a tool sharper than steel. There were cases where noble women attempted to use charm, manipulation, or alliances to improve their position. Some tried to ingratiate themselves with high-ranking wives. Others sought to form quiet bonds with servants who came from similar regions. The Mongol wives were not immune to sympathy, but they were alert to schemes. The empire depended on clarity, and they maintained that clarity with firm boundaries. A captive who tried to rise through manipulation was reassigned to physical labor to remind her of her place until trust could be reevaluated. Yet, not all relationships between Mongol women and captives were hostile. Some formed unexpected understandings. When both had survived invasion, drought, or loss, they recognized similar grief. There were instances recorded briefly, and often only in personal recollections, where a Mongol wife taught a captive how to ride properly, or how to prepare fermented mare's milk without spilling a drop. These quiet gestures did not erase captivity, but they revealed that the empire's women governed through structure, not cruelty. The most powerful among them were the primary wives of high-ranking commanders. These women controlled the allocation of resources within their assigned quarters. They decided which captives served in which tents, who assisted with the animals, who was permitted near the hearths, and who could accompany the household during long migrations. A primary wife could elevate a captive to a position of relative comfort or reduce her daily life to relentless toil. Her decisions were final. The Mongols believed that a household could not function if authority was shared. When a captive noblewoman behaved with discipline and willingness, the Mongol wives sometimes offered her small freedoms permission to walk beyond the tents, a warmer cloak for winter evenings, or lighter duties during migration. These gestures were not kindness as understood by outsiders. They were signs that a woman had learned the rhythms of the camp and no longer required correction. But those who resisted, those who refused to work, who insulted their supervisors, or who clung to a belief that their old social rank still held value, were placed under the watch of the widows. These widows, having lost husbands in war or sickness, held fierce loyalty to the empire and little patience for defiance. They had survived hardship and expected others to endure without protest. When they oversaw a captive, the captive's workload became structured around endurance: long hours grinding grain, extended sessions grooming horses, or repetitive tasks that carved discipline into the body through sheer repetition. Foreign observers interpreted these actions as torture. The Mongols viewed them as correction. The goal was not to break a woman's spirit, but to bring her into functional alignment with the camp. As months passed, many noblewomen found themselves unknowingly shaped by Mongol women rather than Mongol warriors. It was not the lash or the sword that determined their fate, but the steady expectations of those who governed the camp's interior world. These women witnessed everything, every refusal, every effort, every moment of weakness or resolve. And in the records of the empire, their judgments were often the ones that mattered most. Within the Mongol encampment, the women's quarters formed a world that existed beside the warrior's domain, yet operated under a structure difficult for outsiders to recognize. To a noblewoman newly brought into this environment, the separation appeared subtle. The tents were arranged in curved lines, neither rigid nor scattered, and the pathways between them blended naturally into the grasslands. Yet an order governed everything: where each woman slept, which fires she tended, whom she answered to, and the responsibilities assigned to her throughout the day. The hierarchy was not marked by crowns or jewelry. It revealed itself through gestures, the placement of a seat, or the first touch of a hand on the morning's tasks. Senior wives of important commanders occupied tents closest to the family hearth. Widows held a respected but separate role, often guiding younger women with quiet authority. Beneath them were long-standing attendants, horse tenders, and cooks whose influence came from experience rather than blood. A captured noblewoman entered at the lowest tier, no matter the court she came from. Titles carried across battlefields held no meaning here. In the early days after her ritual, a captive observed this order through silence. She watched who rose first at dawn, who prepared the morning fire, who moved through the tents carrying water skins or tools. She noticed that instructions were seldom spoken loudly. A nod, the tilt of a chin, or a glance toward a task was enough to direct movement. The Mongol women valued efficiency born from understanding, not constant command. The new captive learned that each tent served as both shelter and workspace. Inside her assigned tent, she found woven mats, a low table, a wooden chest, and blankets made of felt. There were no symbols of rank, only tools that supported daily life. The woman who oversaw the tent, a senior attendant, spoke softly but wasted no time. She pointed to woven cloth in need of repair, to vessels that required cleaning, or to a section of the tent wall where the felt needed adjusting. The tasks appeared simple, but completing them correctly revealed whether the newcomer paid attention to detail, a trait the Mongols valued deeply. Beyond the routine work, the captive discovered that the women's quarters functioned as a network of observation. No action went unnoticed. A woman who worked diligently gained quiet approval, often shown through shared resources or small guidance during a difficult task. A woman who sulked or refused work found herself isolated. Meals became shorter, interactions minimal, and additional burdens appeared without explanation. It was not punishment as she would have known it in her homeland. It was a way of shaping behavior through community rather than force. Food preparation revealed more about the hierarchy than any spoken rule. Younger women kneaded dough or tended coals. Those with experience handled meat preservation and fermentation, processes essential to survival in long campaigns. The senior wives supervised these tasks only indirectly, stepping forward when needed, but allowing the rhythm of the hearth to guide the younger workers. A captive assigned to this space learned quickly that the hearth was not merely domestic, it was a place of decision-making. Here, news passed between women, strategies for the day formed, and subtle warnings were shared. Animal tending, too, followed in order. Women trained in the care of horses or sheep moved with confidence across the encampment. Their work began before sunrise and continued until dusk. A newcomer often worked alongside them, learning how to approach a restless mare or how to bind a wound on a goat's leg. These lessons demanded patience. Mongol animals were central to the movement and survival of the entire clan, and careless handling risked more than a bruise. Here, the hierarchy was practical. Knowledge equaled authority. Despite the clear structure, life in the women's quarters was not cold. During quiet moments, laughter drifted across the tents. Women mended clothing together, shared stories of past migrations, or hummed songs while preparing hides. These moments did not erase the hardships faced by captives, but they revealed that the Mongol world held both severity and unexpected gentleness. A captured noblewoman slowly learned to move between these states, alert to commands, yet open to the shared humanity that grew in small interactions. The evenings brought another layer of the hierarchy into view. Senior wives gathered to speak with commanders, offering counsel on food supplies, tent arrangements, or the conditions of the animals. Their influence extended beyond the quarters into the decisions of the camp itself. A captive watching from a distance might feel surprise at the quiet power these women held. In her former court, such influence might have required titles or elaborate ceremonies. Here, authority flowed from competence and long-standing trust. For the captive adjusting to this world, the first weeks shaped her more than she realized. Her hands grew accustomed to tasks she had never performed. Her steps aligned with the pace of the women around her. She learned to read the unspoken signals of approval or concern. She began to understand that survival rested not only on strength, but on awareness of the structure into which she had been placed. This silent hierarchy did not aim to break her spirit, though many would later describe it that way. Its purpose was simpler, to fit each person into the larger motion of the camp. The Mongol army moved as a single living body, and the women's quarters formed its unbroken rhythm. A captive who adapted became part of that rhythm. One who resisted found herself pulled into a current she could not control. Though the Mongol encampment appeared fluid to the untrained eye-tents, rising and falling with the movements of herds and warriors, there existed one space that never changed its purpose. Women learned to recognize it quickly, for it carried an atmosphere different from every other corner of camp life. This was the tent reserved for private judgment, a place where disputes were settled, discipline measured, and the conduct of both servants and captives quietly reviewed. It held no external markings. Its authority came not from decoration but from the figures who entered it. For a captured noblewoman, the tent of judgment remained an unspoken boundary. She was told of its existence, not through formal instruction, but through observation. Women who entered did so with bowed heads, and those who exited moved with caution, avoiding unnecessary words. No shouting came from within, no punishment carried out in the open. Mongol discipline was typically administered through the order of daily tasks. Yet, when a conflict disrupted the harmony of the camp, refusal of duties, theft of supplies, or open defiance, the matter moved toward this quiet center. The process inside the tent was not theatrical. It held no raised platform, no instruments of public reprimand. A low table stood at the center, accompanied by cushions arranged in a circle. Senior wives, widows, and occasionally trusted attendants gathered here when the issue required collective attention. The woman whose conduct was under review sat on a cushion opposite the elders. There were no chains, no forced posture. The Mongols believed that dignity, even in correction, revealed the truth of a person's character. The elders began with questions asked in calm, steady tones. They asked not only what had occurred, but why it had occurred. A noblewoman who resisted her duties was not automatically condemned. The elders considered whether she feared the animals, whether she misunderstood instructions, or whether grief from her former life clouded her judgment. The Mongols understood emotional strain even if they did not phrase it in the language of courts, but they also valued order above personal feeling. A woman's reasons mattered, yet the impact of her actions mattered more. When the captive spoke, her words were weighed not by eloquence but by intention. Mongol women listened for truth the way others listened for tone. A lie delivered with confidence carried less weight than a hesitant confession. The elders were skilled in reading small signs, tightness around the eyes, a shift of posture, or the delayed breath of someone trying to shape her story. They did not rush their decisions. The tent remained quiet while the elders considered their responses. Punishment rarely took the form that foreign chroniclers imagined. There were no elaborate displays meant to terrify the camp. Instead, a woman found herself reassigned to tasks meant to challenge her weaknesses. If she neglected the hearth, she was placed under a strict routine of firekeeping. If she disrespected an elder, she was paired with the most stern of attendants. If she refused animal work, she was given long hours caring for the herd until she learned steadiness. The Mongols believed that discipline was most effective when blended into the rhythm of daily life, invisible yet undeniable. Still, the tent of judgment held consequences more severe than task reassignment. In cases where a woman's behavior endangered others, such as damaging tools, disrupting food storage, or provoking conflict, she could be relocated to a different tent, separated from those she trusted. Isolation in the Mongol camp was not physical confinement, but social removal, a condition known to quiet the most rebellious spirits. Life on the steppe relied on cooperation, and those kept at a distance felt the absence keenly. This separation taught the importance of cohesion without stripping a woman of dignity. There were rare moments when judgment became a path toward understanding. Some noblewomen, burdened by the weight of their former identity, entered the tent expecting humiliation. Instead, they found listening and patience. The elders did not dismiss the grief of a fallen kingdom or the shock of capture. They acknowledged it through small gestures, a warm cup placed beside the woman, a softer tone during questioning. These moments did not erase discipline, but they demonstrated the Mongol belief that strength and compassion were not opposing forces. Those who observed the tent over time noted that the process served the entire camp. The elders reviewed not only the conduct of captives, but of their own attendants, granddaughters, and sometimes even junior wives. No woman was exempt from evaluation. This created a system that prioritized function over favoritism. A senior wife who failed in her duties could be corrected gently, the same as a newly taken noblewoman. The balance maintained by this structure allowed the camp to operate without the internal fractures that weakened other empires. To the noblewomen who lived through it, the tent of judgment became a place feared for its scrutiny, yet respected for its fairness. They learned that the Mongols valued order more than cruelty, consistency more than spectacle. A woman disciplined inside the tent was not broken, she was redirected. Over days and weeks, this redirection shaped her behavior, her expectations, and her place within the camp. In this quiet, measured system, the Mongols preserved control without constant force. Their authority moved through the camp like the wind across the steppe, felt but rarely seen, shaping everything without declaring itself. Life in the Mongol encampment taught captured noblewomen that obedience did not carry a single meaning. In their former courts, obedience had often been a performance bowing at the correct time, lowering one's voice before a superior, following the structure of etiquette. Here, on the steppe, the word shifted. It was not decorative. It was not ceremonial. It was practical, woven into the motion of daily survival. A woman who understood this adapted quickly. A woman who did not find herself repeatedly corrected, though rarely through force. Obedience revealed itself first through timing. The Mongol day began before sunrise, and the camp depended on synchronized movement. Fires needed tending, animals needed checking, water needed collecting. A noblewoman unused to early rising learned that her hesitation created a ripple through the camp. The woman responsible for the hearth waited for her. The attendant preparing the morning milk delayed her tasks, and the horses, sensitive to routine, grew restless. The Mongols did not scold her for rising late. They simply increased her tasks until she understood that obedience began with aligning herself to the rhythm that sustained everyone. Another form of obedience emerged through listening. Mongol women did not waste breath repeating instructions. A single demonstration, tying a knot in the felt, preparing a hide, adjusting a horse's bridle, was expected to be enough. The elders believed that attentive observation revealed character more clearly than words. A noblewoman, who asked for the same task to be explained multiple times, was not mocked, but she was watched. A woman who remembered each detail, even when flustered, earned quiet respect. In this world, obedience was not blind submission but focused attention. The third form appeared in movement, specifically in how a woman carried herself through shared spaces. The Mongol tents were arranged with intention. Pathways formed naturally between them, and these spaces were treated almost as private territory. A woman who crossed too close to another's tent without permission, or who pushed into a gathering without acknowledgement, displayed what the Mongols considered a lack of internal discipline. Correction came gently but firmly, a hand on the arm, a guiding gesture, a quiet reminder. In time, the captive learned to move with awareness, stepping lightly where fires crackled, shifting aside when elders passed. Obedience was also expressed through the handling of tools. The Mongols held great respect for the objects that enabled survival: knives, needles, bridles, wooden bowls, and the stone tools used to grind fat and grain. A woman who left tools scattered or misused them signaled carelessness. This was not a small offense. Tools traveled with the army across miles of steppe. Losing or damaging one could delay movement or threaten supplies. The elders addressed such errors directly, placing the woman under supervision until she learned the correct handling. These corrections were steady, not shaming, reflecting a belief that order began with care for the simplest objects. Yet one of the most revealing forms of obedience involved speech. The Mongols valued restraint. Words were used when necessary, not as a constant flow. A noblewoman who spoke too freely, especially with complaints or comparisons to her former life, disrupted the quiet balance of the quarters. The elders did not silence her with force. Instead, they reduced her responsibilities requiring communication. She might be moved away from the hearth or assigned to tasks that allowed little conversation. Through silence, she learned the meaning of measured speech. Despite these structures, obedience did not mean loss of spirit. The Mongols admired resilience. A woman who worked hard but maintained a calm pride was respected. They disapproved not of strength but of resistance that interfered with the camp's motion. Obedience meant cooperation, not submission, to understand the needs of others and to move in step with the household. The most difficult lesson came when dealing with conflict between women. Captive noblewomen sometimes clashed, especially those taken from rival realms. The Mongols viewed such conflict as an unnecessary burden. When tensions grew, the elders intervened, not with punishment, but with forced cooperation. Two women who argued might be sent together to collect water, mend clothing, or tend the horses. The work was structured so they could not complete it without each other. The steppe did not allow division. Survival depended on unity. Through shared labor, conflict often faded, replaced by a weary understanding. There were also forms of obedience that carried deeper emotional weight. A captured woman might be asked to assist in preparing a traveling tent, to accompany a senior wife on errands, or to comfort a child who cried during the night. These tasks touched areas of her identity she had guarded closely: memories of her own home, her family, and the roles she once held. Performing such tasks was not merely physical obedience. It was a quiet acceptance of her place within a world she had not chosen. For many, this was the hardest adjustment, and the elders recognized this without expressing sympathy directly. They offered steadiness instead, a consistent structure into which the woman could gradually settle. Over time, noblewomen discovered that obedience within the Mongol camp held layers. It tested their patience, sharpened their awareness, and required them to reshape the habits of their former lives. Some accepted the changes reluctantly. Others, surprisingly, found comfort in the clarity of expected roles. In courts where schemes and rivalry determined a woman's fate, the directness of Mongol order felt almost relieving. Yet obedience was never final. It was something learned daily, renewed through repeated actions, shaped by circumstance and the shifting movement of the entire camp. As the noblewomen adapted, they did not lose themselves. They simply aligned themselves with a system that demanded precision, cooperation, and resilience, qualities the Mongols believed necessary for every person under their protection and control. In time, captured noblewomen began to understand that the Mongol camp operated on a series of unwritten rules guidelines that shaped daily behavior not through force, but through expectation. These rules were never spoken aloud in full, yet they influenced every interaction, every task, and every hour of the day. They were not laws carved into stone or issued by formal decree. They lived in gestures, habits, and the quiet watching that defined life on the steppe. Women who grasped these rules early found a smoother path through captivity. Those who ignored them discovered their mistakes through subtle, relentless consequences. The first unwritten rule centered on awareness. The steppe was open, but nothing within the camp was unseen. Women learned to keep their eyes lifted, to scan the movement of animals, to read the weather, and to anticipate the needs of others. Awareness was treated as a form of intelligence. A noblewoman who noticed a tent flap stirring in the wind before anyone else, or who fetched water before the basin ran dry, gained respect without receiving praise. Recognition in the camp came not through compliments, but through trust shown in silence. The second rule involved endurance without display. The Mongol world respected strength, but not the kind performed loudly. A woman who worked through exhaustion without complaint demonstrated a resilience valued deeply by the elders. Conversely, one who dramatized her fatigue or sought sympathy disrupted the quiet rhythm of labor. The elders did not reprimand such behavior directly. Instead, the woman found herself assigned tasks that demanded the very endurance she tried to avoid, carrying water over longer distances or tending the hearth during the coldest hours. Through repetition, she learned that surviving the steppe required steady effort, not dramatic suffering. A third rule surrounded ownership of mistakes. In the camp, errors were inevitable. A pot cracked over the fire, a hide tore during scraping, or a rope loosened from a horse's bridle. The Mongols understood these things happened even to the most skilled workers. What mattered was acknowledgement. A woman who stepped forward and fixed her error or asked quietly for guidance was treated with understanding. A woman who hid her mistake or blamed another faced consequences far heavier. The Mongols believed that concealment threatened the entire camp. Each tent, each task, depended on reliability. Honesty, even when uncomfortable, became a core expectation. Another unwritten rule addressed resourcefulness. The steppe offered little excess. Everything was used until no more could be taken from it, felt patched again and again. Tools repaired countless times, food preserved by methods older than memory. A captive who wasted material, who cut hide too generously, or who discarded scraps that could serve another purpose, marked herself as careless. The elders guided her firmly, teaching conservation as a matter of survival. Others learned through observation. The smallest leather fragment offered value. A worn wooden handle could be reshaped, and even leftover ashes from the hearth served in cleaning tasks. Nothing was without purpose. There was also a rule concerning listening beyond words. Communication in the camp relied heavily on unspoken signals. A pointed chin toward the waterskins meant they needed filling. A lingering glance at the horses indicated a saddle required adjusting. A soft hum near the hearth suggested an older woman's need for assistance. Noblewomen from foreign courts, accustomed to direct orders, often struggled at first. They wanted explicit instruction. The Mongol world offered cues instead. Learning to interpret these cues became essential to integration. A woman who mastered this silent language gained autonomy faster than one who demanded clarity. Another rule, subtle yet powerful, was respect for grief without indulgence. Many noblewomen carried deep wounds, families lost, kingdoms burned, futures erased. The Mongols did not forbid grief, nor did they pry into a woman's sorrow. They watched how she carried it. Tears shed quietly during the night were not judged. But if her grief disrupted work, caused conflict, or became a refuge from responsibility, the elders intervened. They did not console her with softness. They guided her back into labor. The steppe did not pause for mourning. Survival required movement, and movement eventually softened grief's hold. The elders also expected a sense of place, not merely physical placement within the camp, but recognition of one's role. A captured noblewoman was no longer a figure of political standing. Her survival hinged on accepting this shift without resentment that poisoned her actions. Some women resisted this truth for months, clinging to memories of power. Others understood more quickly. Titles meant nothing in a world where the wind erased footprints within minutes. In this setting, a woman's value came from her effort, not her lineage. Perhaps the most important unwritten rule dealt with reciprocity. The Mongol camp functioned like an organism, each part supporting the other. When a woman received guidance, she was expected to offer assistance in return, helping an elder to stand, mending another's garment, or stepping forward during moments of collective strain. Acts of reciprocity were not celebrated. They were expected. A woman who consistently took without giving, who relied on others' strength but offered none of her own, slowly found herself isolated. No formal punishment came. Instead, warmth faded around her. Conversations shortened, and tasks became solitary. In the end, survival for a captured noblewoman did not depend solely on obedience or endurance. It relied on her ability to read these unwritten rules and shape herself within them. The Mongol camp did not break her identity. It replaced the structures she once relied on with ones forged from necessity, unity, and adaptation. Over time, many women found themselves moving through these rules naturally, no longer aware of the moment they shifted from outsiders to functioning parts of the encampment's living rhythm. Among the Mongols, authority did not flow only from the men who led armies or commanded herds. There existed a quieter center of power, one that governed the rhythms of households, managed disputes among women, protected children, preserved tradition, and shaped the expectations placed upon every captive brought into the camp. This authority belonged to a single figure, sometimes elderly, sometimes still vigorous, but always unmistakable in presence. She was known simply as the mother of the camp. Her role was not inherited automatically, nor given through marriage. It emerged through decades of observation, survival, and the ability to hold a community together with steadiness rather than force. A woman who became mother of the camp had endured migrations, battles, harsh winters, the deaths of leaders, and the raising of generations. She understood the unspoken language of the steppe, its demands, its moods, and the delicate balance required to keep the camp functioning as one body. Captured noblewomen encountered her rarely at first. Her presence was something spoken of more than seen. The first time a captive noblewoman came face to face with her, the experience was unexpected. The mother of the camp did not dress in elaborate garments or wear symbols of authority. Her coat, often lined with fur, was well used. Her braids showed streaks of gray, but her posture carried no hint of fragility. Her eyes, sharp and quiet, seemed to take in everything without revealing her thoughts. When she moved, others shifted aside naturally, not from fear, but from recognition. It was said that she knew every woman in the camp by name, even the newly captured ones. It was also said that she remembered their first hesitations, their adjustments, their mistakes, and their quiet victories. She noticed the woman who rose early without being told, the one who comforted a crying child in another tent, the one who struggled but refused to stop working. To the noblewomen who arrived expecting cruelty, her presence was puzzling. She did not shout, punish, or demand submission. Yet the entire women's quarters aligned themselves around her, as though held by an invisible thread. Her authority showed itself most clearly during disputes. When tensions rose among attendants, or when a captive's behavior disrupted the household, she entered quietly and listened. She did not interrupt. She allowed the women to speak, recognizing that grievances needed voice before resolution. Only then did she offer guidance. Her words were simple, spoken in a measured tone, yet those words carried weight. And after she spoke, the matter ended. No one pushed further. Her decisions were firm but not harsh, shaped by decades of understanding how fragile the harmony of camp life could be. She also acted as guardian of tradition. The rituals performed at night, the roles assigned to captives, the structure of the women's quarters, all were maintained through her oversight. If a ritual began to drift from its original form, she corrected it gently. If a younger woman attempted to assert authority prematurely, she redirected her with a soft but final gesture. Through her, the lineage of Mongol women's knowledge passed to the next generation. She carried not only stories of the past, but the weight of continuity. To the noblewomen, her guidance did not feel like domination. Instead, it resembled a quiet shaping. A captive who resisted tasks found herself receiving unexpected visits from the mother of the camp during early morning work. She did not scold. She asked questions. What troubles your hands today? Why do you pause when the others move? Her voice was steady, neither sympathetic nor severe. These questions, simple as they were, stripped away excuses and forced reflection. For many noblewomen, those conversations marked the first moment they saw themselves not as prisoners, but as participants in a shared system of survival. At times, her influence extended into more personal spaces. When a captive fell ill, the mother of the camp brought herbs ground in a small wooden bowl, placing them near the hearth where their scent could ease breathing. When a woman cried silently in the night, she did not approach immediately. She waited until morning, offering a task that required movement and focus rather than words. Through such gestures, she maintained dignity even in care. Some noblewomen feared her at first, imagining that her authority granted her the power to punish without challenge. In truth, her strength came from wisdom rather than severity. She had lived through the deaths of husbands, sons, and daughters. She had crossed frozen rivers and endured droughts. She understood loss intimately and recognized its marks on others. Her leadership did not rest on the ability to break spirits, but on the ability to rebuild them into something capable of surviving the steppe. Children adored her. They followed her steps, holding onto her sleeves or carrying small bundles of firewood beside her. Her presence calmed restless infants and encouraged timid girls stepping into their first responsibilities. Older women sought her counsel during difficult decisions, and even commanders deferred to her in matters concerning the quarters. She was the center of a silent network that sustained the camp from within. For the noblewomen who lived under her guidance, transformation often came gradually. They realized that the mother of the camp did not seek to erase their identities. She sought to reshape their understanding of strength. In their former courts, strength had meant influence, persuasion, or social maneuvering. Here, strength meant steadiness, cooperation, and the ability to endure without fracturing. The mother of the camp embodied those qualities so fully that women found themselves responding to her authority, not with resistance, but with respect. When spring returned, and the camp prepared to move once more across the steppe, the noblewomen looked to her for signs when to pack, when to rest, when to gather children and animals. They followed her timing instinctively, trusting that she knew what the land demanded. Over time, they learned that her leadership was not a role one challenged. It was a role one understood, even admired.